Welcome back to the Bible Lore Podcast. In this bonus interview, I've got Dr. Moudhy Al-Rashid here to discuss cuneiform writing and what it tells us about history, something you can learn about in her recently published popular level book, Between Two Rivers, Ancient Mesopotamia and the Birth of History. Dr. Al-Rashid is a research professor at the University of Oxford's Wolfson College. Moody, welcome to the Ale House at the End of the World.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I love that.
Yeah. Well, so what is your book about and how did you first conceive of the idea?
Yeah, so Between Two Rivers tells a history of Mesopotamia, which is the region between and around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and what is now Iraq and Syria, and which was also home to many cultures and civilizations. So Mesopotamia isn't itself a civilization, but it's a place that where many cultures and civilizations rose and fell and flourished. And it tells that history through objects found in an ancient museum from the city of Ur. The museum, which we can put in quotes for now,
Sure.
because it's not completely clear, dates to around 550 BCE, but it contained objects from much earlier eras. And each of those offers a window into some aspect of life in ancient Mesopotamia. So, for example, a really old mace head tells us about violence and warfare and how people made sense of that. A school tablet tells us about how kids learned cuneiform and also got bored learning cuneiform. Um, but the objects aren't really the stars of the show. I would say the true star of the show is the cuneiform writing system, which is what was shared by the many people, the many civilizations of ancient Mesopotamia from around 3000 BCE to 100 CE. So it had a really, really long lifespan. And cuneiform is a wedge-shaped writing system that was impressed into clay. It gets its name from cuneus, which is apparently Latin for wedge. I don't know Latin, but that's the only Latin word I know. And they recorded everything in it. So we really can say so much about life between the two rivers.
Yeah, and that lifespan is really significant when you think about it. Some of our first literature in in alphabetic script comes from Ugarit, somewhere around the 1200, 1300 BCE. So realistically, we are only just now for like written alphabetic script in that kind of detail finally getting to the point where we're surpassing the lifespan of cuneiform, which I think is pretty remarkable to see just how long that life is. It really is something.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's really well put. It gives such a long perspective on it. Sort of half of human history is in
yeah.
cuneiform, which is
Yeah,
nuts.
absolutely.
Mm.
So, as Patreon subscribers will know, I always begin my interviews by welcoming the guests to the Ale House at the End of the World. Astute listeners will have by this point realized I'm referencing Gilgamesh's venture beyond the mountains at the edge of all things, and the garden and ale house of the gods he finds there, with the tavern keeper, the goddess Shiduri, preemptively 86ing him from entering her pub. Something curious that I clocked in your book is that we actually may have a queen from the Sumerian kings list who bears some kind of resemblance to our sacred mother Shiduri. Can you talk a little bit about Kubao? Is it Kubao,
Mhm.
who she was and when she may have reigned?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question because there's so much to unpack within it. I'm gonna split it into two because there are
Sure.
two really interesting directions to go in. One is talking about women who ran taverns, which is already a super cool thing, and then talking about Kubao herself and her place in the Sumerian king list. So first, the fact that women ran taverns in ancient Mesopotamia, I think, is really interesting. It's attested in literature, like Shiduri, the tavern keeper at the edge of the world that you just mentioned, but it's also attested in law collections. So, for example, I think it's in Hammurabi's laws where people can't meet to discuss a crime in a tavern run. But if people meet to discuss a crime in a tavern run by a woman, she goes to jail. So she's sort of
Oh,
responsible for stuff going on under her roof, so to speak.
she's
And then
considered almost like a local administrator in some ways.
Yeah, sort of. Exactly. I mean, taverns, if you think about it, were really and still are important social spaces. And they were even to some degree important ritual spaces because there was something almost liminal about a tavern. It was possibly on the outskirts of a city, but it's also a place where barley turns into beer, which is like actually, when you think about it, a pretty incredible transformation. So there's something quite important about taverns, although they can also be considered a bit tawdry and problematic in other contexts. But back to the women tavern keepers. So Ku Bao. is mentioned in something called the Sumerian King List, which is basically a list of kings who reigned, including legendary kings. And she's said to have reigned, just based on her place in the Sumerian King List, sometime in the middle of the third millennium BCE. And it's in the King List, it says that she reigned Kish, which is a city close to Babylon, for 100 years. So again, we're the lines between mythology, history, historical record, memory are
It's
all
in that
blurred.
same space as Gilgamesh and some of these other kings where you're like, okay, we know Sargon's there. The
Mhm.
guys right before them, we're pretty sure are there. And then beyond that, where's the line? Where's the final one where it's a real person? Who knows?
E Exactly, and what I think is interesting about the Sumerian King List, just to go on a teeny tiny tangent, is, that in the way that it blends all of these elements of sort of literature, mythology, but also actual historical record, because at some point it becomes very, very accurate and is relied upon by Assyriologists to reconstruct a kind of relative chronology of the 3rd millennium BCE, or so the 2000s BCE. What's interesting is that it's not just trying to give that chronology, but it's also trying to show how important kingship is and create a kind of justification for almost empire. So where there can only be one king at a time ruling, even though that wasn't always the case in the 2000s BCE. So yeah, so I think it's a really interesting document. So Kubao appears in there, but interesting, she's not called Eresh, which is the Sumerian word for queen, or Nin, which is another Sumerian word for queen. She's called Lugal, which is the word for king. So that's another interesting thing about that mention of her. Later texts kind of resume her story in a way. So there are some omens that associate her with battle or attack. The There was a kind of subset of scholarship in ancient Mesopotamia, which was super important in almost all periods, which is taking omens from the liver of a sheep. And there are these textbooks that tell the diviners, so the seers who are trying to interpret these, how to interpret particular marks on particular parts of the liver. And in one, there's an omen of Kubao that describes a depression in a part of the liver that they called the yolk, and that was supposed to be a sign of an impending attack. And then a later a letter from the I think it's from the Neo-Assyrian period, a scholar quotes another omen from an anomalous birth as an omen of Kubao, and the outcome, the prediction associated with that is that the land of the king will go to ruin. So she's not really associated with good stuff in these omen texts. However, even later legends describe her as having received kingship from Marduk himself, the god who eventually rises to the top of the Babylonian pantheon. So she appears in a kind of semi-literary historical text called the Wiedner Chronicle. Maybe it's Wiedner. Weidner. I don't know. I've so many words I only ever read, and then I have to say them out loud, and I'm like, I have no idea how to say this.
I was like, oh, this learning all this, reading this scholarship should help me figure out my German and all of that. And then it's like, no, 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 they don't speak. It's not something you can speak. You read these things, and it's
Yeah.
just very different. But yeah, yeah, totally.
Exactly. But this is a history of events for the 3rd millennium BCE up to the reign of King Shulgi, who ruled around 2000-ish BCE. And they center on Babylon and its patron deity Marduk. And in it, she helps a fisherman, basically, who'd been robbed of fish by officers of the king. And Marduk smiled upon her, basically, after that, and entrusted to her, and she's called the tavern keeper in the story, sovereignty over the whole world. So she's a really interesting figure. She's not just in the Sumerian king list. She continues into later traditions in both negative and positive lights.
Wow, that's fascinating. And I think you had another tavern keeper who was listed as a slave, but she also was the tavern keeper
Mhm.
in one of that. And I find that so interesting. It's like it again. It really complicates, I guess, our picture of these things. Like because you obviously did have chattel slavery, you had a lot of things that would look pretty rough, and then you also had kind of these administrative roles that went to slavery, to slaves as well, which I think is such an interesting thing to encounter. It doesn't make it feel better, but it certainly makes it look a lot more interesting, at least.
Hmm. Yeah, and it really shows the kind of breadth of what we can learn from cuneiform about all these different lives and how complicated they were, and how complicated the picture was of labor more generally, what the workforce looked like, and what lives were like within that, whether a person was enslaved or not, because there are various degrees of freedom that are actually pretty difficult to unpack from the sources. But
Right.
it's, as you said, extremely interesting.
Yep. And of course, my listeners will obviously remember the ending of the Epic of Gilgamesh because they listen attentively and take notes the whole time, I assume. But just for new listeners, how does the story end and what's its relationship with the actual city of Uruk?
So I love the ending of the Epic of Gilgamesh, because you feel like there's this young man who is so desperate to find the answer to the question he seeks, and he ends up finding the answer to a totally different question, which really is what we're all trying to do. We're muddling through, and we start off with some questions and we end up with answers to completely different ones. So it ends with him finally finding Utanapishti, who is the survivor, well, one of the survivors of the cataclysmic and almost world ending flood that nearly wiped out all life on Earth. And he asks Utanapishti for the key to immortality. And you can sort of almost feel Utanapishti is just like, ugh. So, like this frustration with this guy who's just like wasting his life looking for an unanswerable thing, and he basically says to him, "You're actually shortening your life by searching for a life without an end, because you're wasting your time wandering the entire world in search of an answer to something that cannot be answered. Go home, um, to go back to your city and rule properly, rule with wisdom and goodness, because it's actually the survival of your community that matters over the survival of any one individual." And his description of the shortness of life, he uses the example of a mayfly who doesn't see the end coming and can be snuffed out at any second. But Gilgamesh is a very stubborn man, and he makes a couple more attempts to secure immortality, including through diving quite deep to secure a plant that is supposed to. I think it's called the plant of heartbeat or some. It's a really poetic name,
Yeah.
which gets stolen by a snake. And finally, he sort of gives up and goes home. And when he gets home, he surveys the city and he sees all the different parts of the city and realizes, okay, yes, my duty is to this city and its people. So I'm going to stop being a terrible king, and I'm going to stop searching for immortality, and rule and make sure that they survive.
Yeah, and it ends with him and Utanapishti's now banished boatman standing on the walls of Uruk and
Mhm.
admiring their glory and splendor and the sheer magnitude of them. So, something that I'm really excited to expand on. That was a real wall in Uruk. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, whether he was responsible for building it or not, I'm pretty sure it was 9 kilometers long and very, very thick in parts, fortified by a number of even thicker bits that were kind of like watchtowers. So the wall is very real. And part of the story describes how, I mean, one of the reasons that the people of Uruk asked the gods for help, asked the gods to send Enkidu, is because he was making them work so hard on this wall, among other much more terrible things. But what's interesting is that the wall is real. The legend behind it may have, come from later eras and may not be related to its actual building, or maybe, who knows. But yeah, Uruk is a very real city with a very real wall
Yeah.
and very real kings.
And I mean, there is something similar in like the biblical texts of whoever built these, these monumental structures that we see across there. People can be proud of them, and yet there's still this cultural memory of this was conscripted labor.
Mhm.
You definitely made a lot of people suffer and die to build this thing. Sometimes, you know, with, I would say, some justification. For example, to segue into our next question, as the Iron Age gets going, they start to use, especially the Assyrians, really unlock the technology of iron, of using charcoal to get their smelters hot enough to form iron in ways that can be used for chariots, for weaponry, for things that previously it was often used for jewelry, and occasionally a sword or something like that. But it was not feasible enough. And of course, the tin and copper trade was so successful. The Assyrians get going, everyone starts rearming and reconsolidating in cities. And over the centuries, these empires expand, they come into conflict, they swarm over the land like a locust. People start building up their own fortifications. And as you're playing these games of inter-regional politics, you get the ascendant Neo-Babylonians, and Nebuchadnezzar II hangs pretty heavily over the biblical texts. His empire would actually only last a couple of decades before itself falling, with its last king being the mysterious Nabonidus. And despite his name's theophoric element referencing the popular Neo-Babylonian god Nabu, found in his predecessors, Nebuchadnezzar and Nabopolassar, and a few others, the final king, Nabonidus' own origins are obscure, and legends seem to have developed that he was some kind of absentee king. Maybe he went crazy. In the Bible, those legends actually get retrojected onto Nebuchadnezzar by the book of Daniel, because honestly, Nabonidus is just not as fun of a character. I mean, he's not as evil of a character. He didn't apparently make the Judahite exiles suffer as much, so it gets put on Nebuchadnezzar. And in a fragment from Qumran, however, we actually do see the tradition of Daniel actually being applied to Nabonidus, which is really a fascinating thing because you can see these legends developing. Something that appears to be originally applied to Nabonidus, we can see it being put back onto Nebuchadnezzar. So that's kind of something for the Bible lore heads out there. But who is the god Nabu?
That's fascinating that there is that kind of can be traced in the
Yeah.
written record. Nabu, or as it was called in Akkadian, Nabu, was the god of writing. He's also minister and scribe of Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, and eventually the head of the Babylonian pantheon. His Marduk's importance sort of rises as the city of Babylon's importance rises, although there isn't, as far as I know, like a comprehensive study of Marduk. So that's a sort of, I think, assumption.
It's an issue that we run into. Like people used to say, "Oh, you know, the Enuma Elish was written as it was written at like right around Hammurabi's time because Hammurabi venerated Marduk." And it's like it seems to more be that Hammurabi's legend grew over the
Hmm.
centuries after, and then Marduk's legend grew. But
Hmm.
Nabu seems to come onto the scene pretty strongly in the Iron Age.
Yes, absolutely. In the first millennium BC, he's really starts to rise to prominence, especially after Sargon II in Assyria, in the north, where he gets incorporated into the kind of royal entourage. But particularly, as you said, in the Neo-Babylonian period, I mean, the kings of that dynasty, which is sometimes called the long century, the long sixth century. So, it's not a very long period, but it is quite a formative one. And the kings are, all of them, or the main ones, have Nabu as part of their names. Yeah, so he's a god of writing, and his iconography is one of my favorite things in the world because it's just a single wedge, a giant wedge, sometimes on a kind of pedestal, and I just absolutely adore that. But he's a very interesting figure. Um,
Yeah. And I think that's like there is this kind of with especially the late Neo-Assyrian kings, you get them famously Ashurbanipal. He's got his library. He is obsessed in some ways with viewing knowledge as power, perhaps, because he sends out merchants and messengers to find any tablet he can get his hands on,
mhm,
which is how
mhm,
we end up with Gilgamesh and so much else. Um,
mhm.
but they were also extremely violent. Obviously, Ashurbanipal is kind of probably one of the most notorious kings of all time. I think you discuss was it him or Esarhaddon that had the mural? Was it, I think a mural that you describe as one of the most violent things ever put onto the record?
Yeah, I think it was, if I'm remembering correctly, it depicts Ashurbanipal in various battles with the Elamite king Teuman. And there are some pretty grisly images in those they're huge stone slabs that are covered in detail. I mean, it's really they're very busy. I can't imagine the amount of work that would have gone into planning those scenes, let alone engraving them. But there are some famous scenes of kind of post battle ritual violence where people are being beheaded and heads are being stacked up. And these are described also in the royal inscriptions, so the quite detailed chronicles of the Neo-Assyrian kings, including Ashurbanipal, that describe the battles they win. They always win the battles; they never lose any battles. And corpses being piled high, but interestingly, doesn't always match up to the archaeological record. We have yet to find a kind of burial of heads or disembodied heads or headless bodies anywhere. But yes, and then in some of these, Teuman, who gets beheaded eventually, his head is sort of hanging from a tree behind Ashurbanipal and his queen. Who are just having a picnic with this head hanging from a tree. So it's the imagery in the reliefs is very, very memorable, let's say. Yes.
And so he kind of has, I think, almost a Ashurbanipal I would say would almost be a kindred spirit to an extent with Nabonidus, except for Nabonidus doesn't seem to have been as vicious of an expansionist in
Mhm.
his regional politics. So who was Nabonidus, this last king? What can we say about where he came from, and what's his significance to archaeology?
Yeah, so Nabonidus, like you said, he has sort of obscure origins, and I think that's one of the reasons he ends up getting so closely associated with archaeology. His mother, interestingly, Adad Gupi, is one of the few. Her story is one of the few autobiographies that survive from ancient Mesopotamia. So, a kind of lengthy inscription in the first person describes her life, and I think it's in Haran, in the north. I believe it's now it's on a slab that's been incorporated into a mosque, but I can't remember the exact details. So he kind of sort of rises from obscurity, but that's not great in ancient Mesopotamia. You have to be in some way connected with a dynasty or with a bloodline or with a really distant past that would lend credibility to your legitimacy as a ruler, as well as your legitimacy in the eyes of the people and the gods. So, as part of his kind of self presentation, he stressed this interest in restoring temples as they were in the past, in connecting himself with past dynasties, following in the footsteps of the previous kings in the Neo Babylonian dynasty who did the same thing. He just sort of took it to another level. And in particular, he renovated the ziggurat complex at Ur, which had sort of fallen into disrepair because that ziggurat complex was dedicated to the moon god, who wasn't that important to this dynasty or previous ones. And um, part of his renovation involved renovating a kind of dwelling for the high priestess, traditionally taken from royal stock. And he installed his daughter back in that role, a role that had again sort of disappeared for a couple of centuries. And in doing that, he connected himself with very, very early kings who had done this, in particular King Sargon, whose daughter Enheduanna was the first such high priestess to the moon god. So he did a lot of work to connect himself with the past. And it's kind of easy to imagine while undertaking renovations of an old building in Mesopotamia that you would find old things among the ruins. And his inscriptions that describe the renovation work and rebuilding work discuss having found inscriptions of ancient kings as well as of priestesses who once lived in the ziggurat complex, such as Inanadu from about 1200 years earlier than Nabonidus. So he includes these descriptions in his royal inscriptions, and it's really interesting because it's sort of like nascent archaeological work in a way, even if it's not how we do archaeology today.
Yeah, I mean they did it in a way that, I mean, in some ways, the early archaeology prior to our modern day, let's say 19th century, even 18th century, when people started doing these diggings, when you had someone like, for example, Napoleon bringing his scientists in the early 1800s to Egypt and then kind of digging up these things, it eventually led to the rediscovery of Akhenaten. Um, they are kind of doing the same thing because at that
Yeah.
time that was part of a cultural campaign on Napoleon's part, right? It
Mhm.
was to give himself legitimacy, to give his campaigns legitimacy, and say, oh, see, we're reconnecting with Alexander the Great, we're reconnecting with the Ptolemies and all of these, in the ancient past, and so it's so interesting to see that that's not just a like that's not an invention of the modern nation state era. That is kind of an almost natural, you could say, human instinct to do that, to connect ourselves with that past, much like, I would say, this podcast and your book, I think, does the same thing in what I hope is a better way than what they did. But it's still so intriguing to me, and especially the parallels between Enheduanna and Enigaldi Nana. So Nabonidus' daughter is the latter Enigaldi Nana, and Enhedu Enheduanna, terrible at saying that name,
They're long
is
names, don't worry.
Sargon the First's daughter. Was that right?
That's right.
And I think she had something like, she became somewhat of a figure around scribal work and things along. Is there? Could you talk a little bit about who she was?
Yeah, absolutely. So Enchedwana is a really interesting figure. There's a wonderful book by Sophus Hele on Enchedwana, if anyone's interested. It's quite short. It's a translation of her poetry as well as some background on her. But she's basically a princess, as you said, the daughter of Sargon, who founded arguably the world's first empire in the 2300s BCE. So this is a very, very long time ago. And he installed her as a high priestess to the moon god Sin, or Sin in Akkadian, in the Akkadian language, Nana in the Sumerian language, at Ur, to help him consolidate power in the south, basically, because the empire was just so large. So she wasn't just a sort of figurehead. She must have exercised some important ritual and administrative roles in the South that helped in some way her dynasty rule. She may also be the earliest such high priestess. However, there is some evidence that a woman buried in the Great Death Pit of Ur's Royal Cemetery. So in Ur's Royal Cemetery, there were 16 graves that are often called royal graves because the people in them were entombed with such lavish grave goods that it's really hard to imagine they were anything but royalty, although there's no direct evidence that they were, except for in one case. And there were also these really grisly death pits where, tens of attendants were kind of killed to follow, possibly to follow these others into the afterlife. And in one of those, called the Great Death Pit, which had, I think, 74 bodies in it, there was one body buried among the attendants who had a silver cup. All the other cups were clay and stone, and she was also covered in jewelry comparable to that of one of the royal graves, Puabi, designated as a queen in her cylinder seal. So although we don't have a name for that person, it's possible that person might have been an early high priestess. But Enchedwana was the I think one of the first that we can call by name. But interestingly, she's also the first named author in history. So the first named author in history is a woman. And it's a little bit more complicated than just saying that, because all the works attributed to her are from slightly later periods. So there's nothing survives from her actual lifetime so far that is signed by her. And there is sort of practices of attributing poetry to past figures who were very important. So it's not a straightforward picture, but it is still the first name, the first authorship claimed at some point in
Yeah.
history.
And I mean, something that a lot of scholars will talk about is the fact that, Susan Ackerman's good at pointing this sort of stuff out, is that the fact that you can see that means that at that time, at the time that they were attributing these works to Enheduanna, would mean that that didn't seem out of place. That was not the kind of thing that would have seemed, it would have seemed acceptable enough to grow as a legend. So
Mhm.
there's at least something there, even if we can't recover exactly what happened. That it still is so fascinating to consider things from that like social cultural perspective of like, okay, so the gender roles could be pretty strict, and yet you get Enheduanna and others like her who are able to kind of throw that off to some extent or another, even just as a cultural memory.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's really well said. There's a kernel of something there that allowed this to grow, and so it's yeah, it's still a very important part of that history.
So with that, so when we get Nabonidus, he pulls a bit of a Sargon,
Mhm.
which is kind of ripping off Sargon the Second, who kind of did the same thing with Sargon the First, but that's okay. So he goes as far as having his daughter Enegaldinana basically be the high priestess. In fact, her name, do we know, is her name kind of referencing Enheduanna, or is it just in referencing the sun god Nana, or do we know kind of what the connection there is?
Yeah, so all of the high priestesses they get names when they sort of ascend to this role. So we actually don't know any Galdinana's birth name. We just know the name that she was given when consecrated as a priestess, and you can already sort of tell an overlap in the names. So Enheduanna is the one from the 2300s. Enanadu is one from around 1800 BCE. And Galdinana is from around 550 BCE. So there are sentences built around the N. N is the term for the type of priestess that they were. So I think Enigaldi Nana's name means something like Nana requested a high priestess or something along those lines.
Okay. No, that's great. I didn't realize that part, that that it was specifically referencing the priestly role with N. That's There we go. See, I
Yeah.
still need to learn cuneiform. Um, could you talk a little bit about, so we've kind of been skirting around this. They're finding all of these artifacts and these
Mhm.
things in the city of Ur as they're doing their sort of proto archaeology, connecting themselves to the past. There are inscriptions that seem to describe some of these objects. What is this museum?
Yeah, so in Enigaldi Nana's dwelling, in the dwelling that was built for her to live in when she took on the role of high priestess, excavators when they were uncovering the different rooms, there was one room that they were very careful to say had an unbroken brick floor that contained objects from much earlier eras. That kind of mention of the unbroken floor is important because what it suggests is that there wasn't a kind of mixing of different archaeological layers that would explain why older things ended up on a higher level of excavation. And among those objects was a boundary stone. So basically, this tombstone shaped thing that records a person's title to land that's currently housed in the Iraq Museum. And that's from around the 1100s BCE. They also found a clay cone of a ruler called Kudur Mabuk, who ruled in the 1800s BCE, a statue fragment of King Shulgi, a king of the third dynasty of Ur from around 2000 BCE, a brick that was then missing of a king from the same dynasty as Shulgi, so again around 2000-ish BCE, and then a mace head with no inscription, as well as some school tablets in an adjacent room. So they really found a mishmash of things from different periods that were all much, much earlier. I mean, if you think about it, if Enigaldi was living in the 500s BCE and something in her palace came from 2000 BCE. That's a 1500-year difference. So it would have been those things would have been very ancient to the inhabitants of that building. And then they found what Leonard Woolley, the head of excavations, called the key that kind of unlocked the mystery, which was a small cylinder shaped clay tablet that described a brick that they couldn't find and said that it was found by a governor and put there for display. The word in Akkadian is built around the root Aleph Mr, Amaru, to see. So that is a very evocative object. I don't think it proves the museum thesis, but I think that it was such an evocative piece that kind of cemented the conclusion, and it made its way into all the subsequent archaeological reports that Woolley put out and has kind of stuck, just like the Library of Ashurbanipal is not exactly a Library of Ashurbanipal, but the label has stuck. So,
Right. We don't know, like, do they categorize things as libraries? Would it look more like an archive? Uh, who are the audiences for this? These are the kind of questions that I don't think we could answer,
mhm,
because is it something that only like a visiting dignitary is allowed to see? It's like a display room of some kind. But at the very least, they wanted to label these ancient objects for whatever purpose we don't know. But that part of it, I think, is such a great way to frame your book, around the material culture, and allow you to talk about the history there. So I loved that conceit. It's so good.
thank you.
With that, there a lot of these objects again are kind of centered around writing, and with that, we do know something you talk about, especially near the end, is that we kind of get a very small sliver of the society at the time. These texts are for elites by elites to some degree or another. You know, you get traveling, people who are involved in trade. There's certainly some form of being associated with wealth in some way that essentially is what necessitated and perpetuated this writing system, especially cuneiform. What can we say, however, about women scribes and women in writing, that are described in writing?
Yeah, it's as you said, I think it's a really important point. Although there are hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets, it's still not everyone that's represented in them, and even those who are not part of the kind of upper echelons of society that are represented in these texts tend to be represented from the perspective of someone having to make a record of somebody's work or of purchase or some other element from that perspective. So not necessarily from the life being recorded, but yes, women wrote stuff down too. Although overwhelmingly scribes and scholars were men, there is quite a bit of evidence that women, particularly from the old Babylonian period onward, when it starts to pick up, girls did learn how to be scribes, and women did become professional scribes, and in some cases scholars as well. So for example, in school context, so in archaeological contexts that we know were schools, there are tablets that are signed by hand of a female scribe, that with the kind of female determinative in cuneiform, or will have the name of a girl, which we again know is the name of a girl from the way the name sounds, but also from there's a sign that appears in front of names that tells you how to understand the gender of the person whose name follows. There seems to be, like I said, an uptick in this from the old Babylonian period, so around 2000 or 1900 BCE to 1600 BCE. That's the old Babylonian period, particularly in a city of Sippar, which is a city of the Naditum, which is a type of priestess, maybe we can say, particularly to the sun god Shamash. They were the economic backbone in a way of the city, mostly involved in real estate, where they rented properties out or bought and sold properties. They were sort of landlords to many in the city. And so, yeah, so these women were symbolically married to the sun god Shamash. And as part of that marriage, they were given a dowry. And it's possible that many of them invested that dowry that came along with the role, and tried to pass it on to daughters that they then adopted as well. So there are a lot of records of adoption by Naditum women. And interestingly, as a kind of side note, some of these Naditum women are ancestors to the scribe who wrote down the Atrahasis epic. So his name was Epic, and the Atrahasis epic is the old Babylonian version of the flood story that appears in Gilgamesh. So it's like a sort of fun tangent. But
I
women
didn't know
scribe,
that. I'd known a little bit about the Scribal class, but I did not know that they were so heavily involved in the Atrahasis epic. That really ties so many things together. That's awesome. Sorry to interrupt, but that's
yeah,
so
no,
cool.
no problem. It's so interesting that, yeah, that this brother of one of these, and I don't actually know if it's a brother. I think he's a descendant of one of these women. Ended up writing down this epic. But within that community, women scribes served them. But even in later periods, there were scribes who were women, and there were physicians who were women. So they kind of continue their training to specialize in particular types of scholarship, and other sort of academics, let's say, um, who were women. So it's very interesting to get to kind of bring that element of society to light through these texts.
And I guess so when we talk about, because this gets into a question that I've had a little bit, when we talk about how things like specialization were done, it does seem like writing becomes sort of the backbone of a lot of this. Is it primarily that your further training of specialization comes in, let's say, if you're a someone who becomes an elder or a doctor, or uh, it seems like there are a lot of lists that come through, especially things like omen lists and legal lists and different. Do we know kind of what that specialization looked like? Was it just from there, like you learn how to write, you learn how to, your teacher comes over and clears off your style or your clay tablet a few times when you mess up, hits you on the hand. Is that kind of where it goes from there, is into learning these lists, or do we not have enough details on how the schooling went?
No, we have quite a bit of detail of how people went on to specialize once they were done with the basics of scribal education, which is not that basic. I mean, it goes pretty deep. Yeah,
Yeah.
it goes from impressing a single wedge over and over again as a child to mastering Sumerian literature and model contracts, and quite complicated math that I will be honest, I don't fully understand when I read those texts. um, but beyond that, they would take on kind of apprenticeships where they would work with an established whatever the type of scholar it was,
Sure.
whether it's a astronomer or a diviner, for example. And in some cases, we can even trace like individuals' careers. So there's one physician from the Neo-Assyrian period called Kisir Ashur, whose career begins kind of yes as a scribe and then as an apprentice, but he's specializing to become a medical professional, a particular kind called an ashipu, which is often translated as exorcist, which is not my favorite translation in the world, but it's how people translate that if
Yeah.
someone wants to Google it. And there's a good evidence that he mastered veterinary medicine first, which makes sense because it's, the analogy between animal and human bodies can really help you understand what's inside a person without the benefit of something like an ultrasound or x-ray device. So and then he goes on to write a whole bunch of medical tablets and likely also use those in the practice of medicine. So we do have quite a lot of information on how people ended up specializing, and it's really interesting to track those careers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think some of the school stuff is some of my favorite parts of your book, so I won't give away too much there, but definitely buy the book. There's so much great stuff. It I don't think there's anything quite as humanizing as seeing like children writing
Mm,
and messing up and talking about their struggles in some of it. So
mhm.
I won't spoil too much, but to say that is such a wonderful section of the book. But
Thank you.
on to the more kind of scientific side of things, how do we date things? I think you see that we have this famous eclipse of 763 BCE that ends up being one of our earliest events that gives us like a concrete scientific alignment. Before this and after, kind of, how do we date things beyond around that, and especially prior to that?
Yeah, so as you said, in 763 BCE, I think it's in the summer, so June 763 BCE, there was a total solar eclipse that was visible from Nineveh in the north of Mesopotamia, in what was the Assyrian Empire. And there's a record of that in a kind of a list of yearly appointed officials. I think they called them eponym lists, if anybody wants to Google it. And it was for an official called, it was a short entry for an official called Bur Sagale. And it reads, in the month Simanu, an eclipse of the sun took place. And that's the kind of anchor. So anything after that can be dated with precision to the year and in the few centuries before as well. But anything before that, before those few centuries, is we can really only orient things in relation to each other as a kind of relative chronology. As a result, There are four possible chronologies followed for those early periods: the high, middle, low, and ultra low. Most people follow the middle chronology as a kind of average point between all of them. Justifications for each one depends on how to interpret early reports of astronomical phenomena recorded in non-astronomical texts like omens. So it's not always the most reliable source of information because of how omens were generated and structured. They followed their own sort of rules that don't always tally with observational phenomena. But the people of the sort of second millennium BC and even earlier did make records like the Sumerian king lists that help with us trying to kind of put things and people and events in the right order. So even if we don't know for sure what years they happened, we know at least what, in what sequence they took place.
So that's us talking about science from our perspective and trying to
Mhm.
taxonomize and categorize and chronologize all of these things from a modern perspective with the benefit of all of these people working through trying to figure a lot of things out. What does science and especially astronomy look like in this period?
So, astronomy changes quite a lot over the course of the second and first millennia BCE. There's a great term that's coined by Dr. Willis Monroe. He calls it astronomology, which is a mix of astronomy and astrology because the two were really intertwined in ancient Mesopotamia. In the earlier periods, people observed astronomical phenomena, the movement of planets, the occurrence of eclipses, things that were regularly occurring, not just random stuff like meteors, for example, although those sometimes came into play. Those were understood to be messages from the deities, from deities about events to come on Earth. So that observational kind of program was intimately tied with trying to figure out what was going to happen next on Earth. And in the first millennium BCE, this is particularly important for kings who are trying to run really big empires and make decisions around ruling and whether to go to war, whether to make a journey. Any sort of decision had to be backed with some kind of observation of what's going on in the sky and other forms of omen taking that to kind of back those up as well. But sometime in the first millennium BCE, the kind of purpose for doing this changes, and the way it gets done changes. It goes from being about making predictions on Earth to making predictions about other astronomical phenomena. It was still important to try to figure out what was going on in the social and political sphere, but alongside that, there was also this kind of burgeoning science of how do we understand what's going to come next in the sky itself. And really, really rich records of those phenomena were made, particularly in the kind of Neo-Babylonian period onward. We call them the astronomical diaries. We're not 100% sure who wrote them, but they record all sorts of stuff happening in the sky, where planets were, and what was happening with eclipses, what eclipses were predicted but not seen or that were seen, but also stuff going on land, like the price of grains or the water level of the Euphrates. And eventually the data that was collected in these and other observational astronomical texts become the kind of they lay the groundwork for mathematical astronomy. So there's a really interesting progression from detailed observation taken in really early periods to understand what was going on Earth as well as in the sky, to detailed observations to understand what's going on in the sky, to math like pure abstract, very confusing to understand math. So it's a huge question, and it's incredibly interesting, and I think it really speaks to how people made sense of the world back then and what they thought was worth writing down.
Yeah, I think one of the coolest things that you talk about is a tablet that abstracts the charting of a planet's path into numbers, into essentially something like coordinates,
Hmm.
which I think is so fascinating because this is also the time when you start to first get the Greeks who learned from these Mesopotamians a bit about the math, and they some of them figure out that the planet is round. There are all of these things that are going on kind of simultaneously, and we don't always get to see the exchange of like where they get it. Sometimes we do. The Greeks were good at leaving diaries about some of these things, about where they picked it up. It gets passed through Egypt and into yeah, different places. But that is one of the coolest things to me, that because it starts with someone just tracking it and looking up into the sky and saying, okay, so the stars stay in the same place every night. We can predict that, except for these extremely, some of them are extremely bright little ones up there. And then what does, and they make connections that are maybe misfires of pattern recognition, but they can see something's going on that's a little bit different about these about the planets, essentially. And the fact that someone kind of cracked like a few of them really do make genuine contributions to scientific knowledge as we would understand it is, I mean, that's amazing, because there's often this, I think, understanding of the past that is very demeaning, I would say, and
Yeah.
sort of primitivizing, that I don't think that they deserve. Could you speak about how you handle that, and how you see these people in the difference between, like, we do have to recognize that we do have the benefit of 3,000 years beyond these people, 2,500 years beyond these people, of instruction and learning, and but how do we make sure that we're also kind of giving them their due as well?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think there's been a really nice kind of movement within Assyriology for the last couple of decades of moving away from this idea that they weren't doing science because it's clouded by some of the religious or mythological language. And that includes not just astronomical texts, but medical texts as well, toward really recognizing that there were some incredibly systematic ways of approaching the world and really strict kind of programs for observation and empirical science that were followed in order to generate these texts. And that however it may or may not tally with modern science is kind of irrelevant because it's a history of people trying to make sense of their world in a systematic way, and the texts more than demonstrate that. And I think, I mean, from my perspective, it's less about kind of saying it's science and science, and more about just saying what they did, and then anyone who kind of grasps it is like, oh yes, that's definitely science. And I think it's not just about observation and prediction and all the other kind of elements that we traditionally associate with science, but also how they organized knowledge and how they organized information. And some of the ways they did that are legacies that continue in modern science, fed through, ancient Greece, such as the zodiac, for example. Not just looking at the sky and saying that a planet was in a particular constellation, but actually dividing the ecliptic, so the section of the sky where eclipses take place, into 12 equal portions of 30 degrees each. That's something that they came up with. I mean, it's a way, it's really phenomenal how they approached organizing information,
and
just
and
more
I mean,
generally.
we still use that for degrees today. I mean, that is still
Hmm.
how we organize. It's 360 degrees is based off of that from
Hmm.
3,000 years ago, and you still use it on your watch. We still have things that are divided in that way. That is still to this day a legacy of Egyptian, Greek, and Mesopotamian science. Frankly,
Yes, absolutely. It's just, I think it's so incredibly moving that that's still part of our world, and that's, people came up with that at some point, and they did it a very very long time ago as part of a really kind of rich context of observing stuff, but also trying to organize information in schematic ways that made it a little bit easier to keep track of. So it's just an incredibly interesting history.
yeah, absolutely. As we're heading into the final portion here, you, I think, from what I've seen, are a bit of a dog person. I've got my cat Barbara. She bows to Ea alone. What can we say about animals during this period, and especially dogs, when it comes to, and what's their relationship to some of our tablets that we've discovered?
Yeah, I love this question because I do love animals, and I do have two lovely lovely dogs. Um, I can so I get a lot of questions about cats online, and I finally I incorporated some of it into my book, which is we do know about cats from omens, back to our sort of observation and prediction. And interestingly, one of my favorite kind of cat facts is that a black cat, if spotted near a person's house, was a sign that good fortune was going to come to that house. So they were actually good luck.
How'd they get the short shrift later? What the
Yeah,
hell? They
I
were,
know.
these Europeans, you can't trust them.
But I know a lot more about dogs. I mean, dogs did quite a lot for people in
Yeah.
ancient Mesopotamia in all periods. They went to war. There are records as as early as the late third millennium BC about food for dogs that were going to war, and information about their handlers. They were associated with healing. As a historian of science and medicine in particular, this is, I think, a really interesting connection. Some have suggested that it might be that the saliva of a dog is associated with healing, but I don't think so.
Well, I
It's
mean,
pretty
there
interesting.
is that one in the L's drinking party as part of the hangover cure. They do include in like the concoction that they mix up hair of the dog, like which is not great. But
No.
you know what? Fine, they were trying. I didn't realize that hair of the dog was that old, but it is in L's drinking party, so why not? As well as I think urine and feces. So some
Okay,
some some
okay.
really special stuff going on there, and you hope that it was only the gods that were drinking this to cure their hangovers and not the humans.
Yes, that doesn't sound, like a cure for anything really, really, but they were, but interestingly, they were associated with healing, and they were attached to temples. There was a temple in Isin that was a dog temple where 30, I think just over 30 dogs were buried beneath the ramp entering to the temple, who may have been in some way attached to healing in the temple, or to the goddess Gula, the healing goddess herself. And in fact, hymns to Gula talk sometimes about how if you neglect a hurt dog, then you kind of incur the wrath of Gula. So you shouldn't. I think they also mention cats, but I can't remember what they say about cats.
We got to bring that back, you know.
Yeah, I agree completely. Um, and dogs were also protective. I mean, we have two dogs who bark almost incessantly. It's not the most kind of reliable method of telling us that someone's at the door, because I'm pretty sure they bark if someone's at the door of our neighbor four doors down.
Yeah.
But what I think is lovely is that these tiny dog figurines with phrases kind of in cuneiform on the side of them, which may be names, may not be, were buried in under the floor, and there's some found in Quiche. There's some found in, I want to say, Nineveh or Nimrud, one of the palaces, as protective kind of figurines to protect the building and the people in it. But aside from that, we also know a bit about veterinary care, not just for dogs, but for horses in particular. There are, for example, recipes for horse colic from the Neo Assyrian libraries. And the earliest veterinarian might be from around 2100 BCE in Lagash, named Ur Lugal Edina. A seal refers to him as a kind of vizier of a minister of Shakan, the Sumerian god of cattle, and as the doctor. So he's the doctor. I am your servant, saying I'm the servant of Shakan. So he might have been a kind of the earliest vet that we know of. So there are lots of ways to understand how people interacted with animals, from the smaller pets like dogs to ones that they relied on for other things like horses and cattle.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that you pointed out is you can even see like a paw print that's been stepped on onto a clay tablet, which I'm sure whoever was trying to use that really loved that, waking up to find that it'd been stepped on. But it's phenomenal.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, the bricks, they're bricks, mud bricks with lots of dog paw prints on them. But I mean, if you think about it, I mean, these bricks were laid out to dry in the sun, and there were
oh,
animals everywhere. So,
oh no, I think we had our dogs and cats like when my parents were laying concrete growing up for our driveway. You ended up with paw prints in that.
oh,
That's
that's
just
so
the nature
lovely.
of things.
I
And
love
it's,
that.
and it's been that way for 3,000, 4,000 years. So
Exactly. Oh, some things don't change.
something you remark on, I think, fairly late in the book is the way that getting into Assyriology and recognizing the human elements of people experiencing success and failure and suffering and discovery. It inspired you to focus on this late Bronze Age, Iron Age period. And I, for one, feel like this book is such a genuine success in that endeavor. However, I must say, your publisher did send me the book. So if you're listening to this, you can't take my word for it. I only paid the import fees because of Brexit. So you're going to have to buy this book and check it out for yourself. So, Moody, thank you so much for coming on. Where can folks get your book and where can they find out more about you?
Thank you so much for having me. It was a really illuminating discussion. I feel like, yeah, it was we covered so much ground. The book, you can buy it at pretty much any book outlet. My favorite is bookshop.org because you can support local bookstores,
Awesome.
and Blackwell's books, Waterstones, and of course the Amazon is
Yeah.
another place to get it. So, but yeah, I hope you like it if you read it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again. All of your links will be in the description for the show. And for all of you listening, we'll see you next time on the Bible Lore Podcast. Bye bye.